Welcome to the Australian School of Business. I'm here today to speak to Dr. Thomas Schillemans, who is a visiting fellow at the Centre for Social Impact at the Australian School of Business. Dr. Schillemans, you're from the Netherlands and you're here to examine how mass media affects government. Can you tell me why you chose that subject?
Basically what I'm trying to do is fill a void in the research. If you look at developments in the public sector, you would see that in most democratic governments or in most democratic systems there are many sort of organizations which are not under direct control of central governments. You have either statutory bodies, there are many regulatory agencies, it could be non-governmental organizations being contracted and working for the government. So there's a large public sector. We often think of it as a sort of a consistent system, whereas in fact it's very much spread out. There are many different bodies within the public sector. Altogether you can call them the unelected, in the sense that their leadership are not directly elected. Basically I'm looking at the way these organizations are portrayed in the media and cope with the media environment. And I think that's it's a very salient sort of research. If you look at analysis of media reports on the public sector, you will find that about 1/3 of the stories are about the unelected organizations, whereas all our research, I would say at least 95%, is on the elected organizations. All the research in communications and the role of the media focuses on political parties, focuses on central government departments, etc. Very logical, because that's the largest part. But still you have 1/3 of the public sector when it comes to the media stories, which are left out of it. So I thought this is basically a topic that is salient. You will see in a sort of society where the media have become very important, also these organizations have to cope with the media. Also these organizations are described in media stories. And we really don't know how that happens or what they do, how it affects their strategies. So that's what I'm looking at.
Can you tell me what you've discovered so far about the situation in Australia?
Well, okay, I can tell a few things about it. You know, I'm still in the middle of it. There's some of the work I'm still having to do. But I've found a few things that really struck me. If I compare Australia to the Netherlands, one of the things that really strikes me is when it comes, you know, if you look at the role of the media, I make a distinction between 4 types of influence the media can have. First of all, it's on the sort of stories that are being told on governments. Secondly, it's how organizations monitor the media. Thirdly, it's the role of the media in internal organization. And fourthly, it's about the role of the media in external strategies. Well, if I look at Australia, I think the media monitoring is a lot more intensive and a lot more advanced and professional than I would have seen in the Netherlands. For instance, if you look, I've spoken to a number of communications people from different government departments and public organizations, and they would all be describing how they would get updates of media reporting, you know, every hour or every 2 hours, how they would always prepare sort of answers. By 7 o'clock in the morning, the sort of stories for the day had been determined already. I mean, we have the same thing in the Netherlands, but it is not that advanced. Well, just to give a practical example, I've spoken a lot to one of the primary communications advisors of one of the Dutch ministers. He is still looking at the text TV to see what happens in the world. Whereas here in Australia you see on the Blackberries the news reports coming in all the time. So in that respect I think on the level of media monitoring, Australia is at least further, or well stronger at least, than what I've seen in the Netherlands. And secondly, what it also implies, it is important in the media environment to keep something of message control. Here in Australia you will see that the sort of level of centralization of organization within government is much further advanced than in the Netherlands, also in order to keep message control. There are lots of complaints. I mean, there have been a few books coming out the last few years in Australia that really challenged the role of the media. You had this book on Silencing Dissent by Madison and Hamilton, also partly authored here at UNSW, on how in this environment the government is really well silencing dissent also in media environments. You had a book on selling the Australian government. So in that sense, it's sort of centralization and the importance of media monitoring is a lot higher here than I saw in the Netherlands and that I was expecting beforehand.
Can you tell me which government has harnessed the media better, the Netherlands or Australia?
I know it's a two-sided thing. In one respect, to work with the media, you have to adopt to what is called media logic, which means you have to follow the aims and production procedures and the rules of the media if you want to be pictured in a positive way in the media. So in that respect, I think it's been done better here in Australia. So I think more professional, better centralized, better organized. But the backlash of it is somehow that I think the sort of problem definition in Australian government has become much more influenced by the possibility of negative media stories than in the Netherlands. So it's in a way, it's a bit of a loss of autonomy on the part of the government to be watching so closely what is happening in the media or what could happen in the media. And the real issue that could be at stake here is that governments become very risk averse because they are afraid that the negative stories might come up, so they will prevent negative stories from featuring. Well, that can have a good side of it, but it can also make them risk averse and they won't be able to tackle difficult problems. So it's a two-sided thing. They're more professional, but they could also be more influenced by the media and becoming more risk averse.
You're going to compare the role between the government and the media in Australia, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom and Norway. Can you tell me what role the existence of a tabloid press plays in all of that?
Well, as I see it now, I would suppose it's a very big role because in the Netherlands we don't have a real tabloid press. We have one very, what they call it a populist newspaper, which is a bit comparable to a tabloid, but it really doesn't go so far. To be honest, as a foreigner to this country, I try to read a lot of newspapers. I'm often a bit shocked about the frankness and the strong wording that are used in newspapers, and also the strong wording politicians choose to use. So in that way, I think that the political climate and news climate is rougher here, which you could expect to be related to the higher level of media professionalization here than in the Netherlands. I think my test case with the 4 countries could perhaps confirm that, because also the UK and even Norway does have a tabloid press. So it could be that the Netherlands are the least advanced when it comes to media professionalization, and that could be related to the tabloids. I would expect that, but as a scientist I have to be a bit careful, but I think that's what I expect.
Generally, has the mass media made government more accountable?
Well, to some sense, yes. I think the stories, I'm very positive about the role of the mass media. The sort of insights we get into government are a lot further than they used to be in the past. There's a great story in the Netherlands. There was, at some point, there was a documentary being made on the prisoners of war, on Dutch prisoners of war actually, or German prisoners of war from the Dutch during the Second World War. And it was banned from publication for 20 years because it didn't conform to the story, because we had the story, we were invaded by the Germans, and the war only lasted 5 days, so we were not very good at defending ourselves. And this story told something different about the bad treatment of the German prisoners, the few German prisoners we actually took. It was banned from publication for over 20 years in the Netherlands, and finally in the 1970s it was broadcasted. So I think that's a very good thing. It's a good example how more things are uncovered, and so the governments become more accountable. Well, the bad thing again about it, the thing that worries me a little bit, is the sort of defensiveness this may invoke in governments. The sort of energy they will put into not having negative stories to appear. I mean, what we would really want is that nothing bad happens, but the sort of outcome we could have is that we get so professional that we don't let the bad things come out. So that's the sort of thing that worries me a little bit here.
Our Prime Minister Kevin Rudd has been using tools like Facebook and Twitter to communicate with his constituency. Is that common for a government executive?
Well, I think government executives are experimenting with it. And it's still, very new, and we still don't know how long it will be salient and important. We see the same thing happening in the Netherlands sometimes, but I still think the reason you and I know it is probably because we've read about it in the newspapers or seen it on TV. So still the traditional media, certainly in political cycles, are most important. As it is now, I suppose, the new media, also like Facebook or Twitter, etc., they are a way to get your story into the traditional media. So in that sense, they can be important. also because it gives you some sort of message control and then possibility to strike early in a way. But still, you reach most people through the traditional media, and then they will log on to your Facebook page to see what's happening there.
Mm-hmm. In an increasingly changing media landscape, how is the executive in the Netherlands using that to communicate with its constituency?
Well, very reluctantly. I've been doing a sample of 28 of the unelected organizations. I think there are 2 of them who do have a Twitter page, what I found out. One of them is our National Parks Authority. Well, they're really not comparable to Australian national parks, but still we do have a number of them. They are trying to broadcast all sorts of events that are happening. I think last year there was an eagle suddenly breeding in the Netherlands. That is really something that's very rare. And they broadcasted it also on TV, on the website, but also through Twitter this was announced. So they use it a little bit. But still I would feel it's very much an experimental phase because they're looking at ways how to use it. And it can wade off very soon. I remember there was one report on government communication from the Netherlands, I think it's from 1995, which put all of its eggs in the basket of television, and there was something called internet back then, but they didn't think it was very important. So they think, well, for the next 10 years in government communication, we should really focus on television because that is really the big thing. And well, between 1995 and 2005, the big thing was, of course, the internet evolving. So I think we're a bit in the same situation now when it comes to Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, etc., all the social media. They might become very important, but we have to wait and see, I think.
What are the dangers in becoming what you call a mediaocracy compared to a democracy?
Well, the dangers could be, well, there are a few dangers there. One could be that in order to, you have to, adapt your communication to the demands of the medium, and I don't mean that negative in any sense, but it would mean that your sort of problem definition becomes the same problem definition that the journalists use. It has been widely researched how in news stories are always built up on the same types of frames, particularly in election times. The horse race is a typical frame that is being used. All election campaigning coming back to will here in Australia probably will Rudd finally beat the coalition or not, which makes the stories in a specific frame. You could tell a different story, you could tell a contentive story, you could tell many different stories. So one of the dangers is that all policy debates will become molded into the sort of frames the media have to use in order to tell a story. I mean, they need that. We need to narrow down the information in order to make it understandable for the public. But if governments do the same thing, they will lose a lot of information and become dumber in a way. So I think that's a real difficulty. The second thing will be what I talked about earlier. There's a real risk of being risk averse, how governments will try to, and public organizations will try to prevent anything that might lead to negative stories from happening, which also makes them, not taking on challenges. And the third thing that I could see would be it has a very large drive towards centralization. I spoke to one in another state here in Australia from the education department where they had over 1,000 schools, over 1,000 principals, where they had made contracts with every single principal that he or she was not allowed to speak out in the media prior to consultation with the people from the department. So in that sense, there's a real centralization of communication, also of organizations, which may lead to a loss of autonomy in this case for schools. And I think from there are real dangers there. So I think the centralization could have a negative effect. It can make organizations risk averse, and your problem definition could be driven only by media logic. Well, that's something that concerns me at least.
Thanks very much for your time.